Chapter 10. Daniel. The year 1969. Harvest time neared its end, and Alan told Daniel he had been sneaking food from the fields during the harvest, which was why the Laotians punished him by taking his toes. Either from defiance or because he knew he wouldn't leave the prison alive, Alan stole food from the fields to share with his fellow prisoners. After his captors took his toes, Alan increased the amount of food he took and shared with the rest of the prisoners. Daniel believed that Alan did it because every morsel he took was that much more his enemies wouldn't have for themselves. Alan likely felt a mental victory that helped him through his long days of torture and food deprivation. The sun broke the darkness through the trees that surrounded the prison, and Alan's heated words of resistance woke Daniel. As quickly as his one good leg allowed, he rushed to his cell door to see his friend carried by 4 guards, one each at his feet and hands. Daniel lost sight of the men. All he could do was listen. The sounds he heard were as terrible as they had been the night Alan's toes had been taken. One of the men walked back into Alan's cell, and Daniel heard the shuffling noise of a search. A few minutes later, the guard left his cell. Daniel looked through the cell door opening and saw the guard carrying food. Someone barked a loud order, and Daniel knew the voice. Captain Fan. Daniel feared what was about to happen. A guard opened his cell and grabbed him by the arm. Daniel's heart pounded. Guards opened every cell and escorted each prisoner to the center of the compound within eyesight of Alan. At Alan's feet lay a little pile of food. Each prisoner knew where it had come from, and without a doubt, they all had an idea of what was in store for Alan, the man who stole it. Only Daniel had gotten to know him enough to call him a friend. But Daniel knew each prisoner looked up to the man who had somehow managed to sneak them food, even if only a tiny portion. Captain Fan pointed at the food, and 3 of his men rushed to the little pile and picked up what they could carry in one hand. He then pointed in a sweeping motion toward Daniel and the other prisoners, and the guards took the food and distributed it to them. They were all starving and jumped at the opportunity to have the little extra bit of food. They greedily took it from the guards and ate everything given. Daniel scarfed down his gift, but as he swallowed the last morsel, his eyes fell on something he saw for the first time. He stared at a little bamboo pole that protruded from the ground about 18 inches. His gaze turned toward Captain Fan, who smiled as he watched each prisoner eat his morsel of food. When everyone had eaten, the captain issued an order to his men and pointed at the little pole sticking up from the ground. The guards forced Alan onto the ground and into a sitting position. Roughly, they pulled his knees into his chest and lashed them in place with a rope made from tree bark. They then tied Alan's feet together and secured them tightly against his body. Daniel glanced around at the other prisoners. No one had seen this action before, and they all looked as confused as Daniel was frightened. The guards secured a small rope around Alan's torso, including his legs in the binding, and dragged him toward the protruding pole. They then threw a rope over a tree limb that was directly above the pole. Every prisoner remained standing, still looking puzzled by the events, and all except Daniel continued to eat. The looks of confusion changed to concern when the guards hoisted Alan into the air. They all stared at him, swinging from side to side, like a pendulum. But Daniel knew what was happening. He knew Alan had already been scarred, and he could not be allowed to leave the prison alive. Daniel's heart raced. He wanted to stop what was about to happen, but he knew he was helpless. Alan had already told him he believed he would die in this camp, but he recently confided to Daniel, in one of the only times they were able to speak, that he was physically and emotionally exhausted and could not go on. "The years I've been held captive and been tortured," Alan had said, "have taken too much from me. I don't believe in suicide, but a man can take only so much. I have decided death preferable to life in this hell. I know the good captain will not allow my death to be immediate, but I'm prepared for any suffering that leads to my death. and my freedom. Daniel could not believe what he'd been told, but he knew his time in this hell had been short compared to Alan's. Part of him understood his friend's decision, though he would not accept it. Another part of him wondered if he would ultimately come to the same conclusion if he survived long enough. Captain Pham issued an order, and a guard approached Alan. The guard used a knife to cut open the seat to what remained of Alan's ragged pants, leaving the little flaps hanging down to sway with Alan's pendulum motion. Some of the prisoners struggled, unsuccessfully, to look in another direction. They seemed to understand what was happening. Daniel, with his one good leg, rushed toward Alan to kick down the pole. A guard abruptly knocked him to the ground. A second prisoner rushed toward the pole, then a third and a fourth. None of them had any real physical strength, and all were easily knocked to the ground. Lying in the dirt, where he'd been knocked down, Daniel watched Captain Pham make a sweeping motion to point at each prisoner, then point toward the cells. The guards grabbed the prisoners and dragged each of them to their cells. At the commander's order, they left only Daniel to witness what was to come next. Why? Daniel didn't know. Maybe Captain Pham suspected he and Alan had formed a friendship, and the captain knew Alan had been providing him with food. Captain Pham pointed toward Alan, and two guards took a position, one on each side of him. A third lowered Alan until his buttocks were all but touching the bamboo pole. Alan panted heavy, rapid breaths. From what Daniel could tell, his friend had no knowledge of the pole below him, but he surely knew something horrible was about to happen. The two guards guided Alan into position, and when one nodded, the third released the rope. Alan fell straight down onto the pole, the length of which penetrated his rectum, certainly tearing his flesh at its entry. The pole drove into his body cavity as his weight settled onto the ground. He screamed as no one had ever screamed before. Daniel turned his head and covered his ears, trying to block out the sound of his friend's horrible suffering. Captain Pham yelled out an order, and a guard pulled Daniel's hands from his ears, and another held his head, forcing him to watch and listen. Alan leaned to one side as if trying to escape the pole, but the guards had firmly driven it into the ground. When he leaned, it didn't move. It had to have torn into him even deeper, ripping into his internal organs. A stream of blood oozed down the pole and onto the ground beneath Alan's body, creating a dark puddle around him. Alan screamed even louder and leaned to the other side. Daniel struggled to free himself to cover his ears and turn his head. Closing his eyes wasn't enough. He had to turn away. The blood streamed faster. It flooded out onto the ground, turning it dark red. Daniel heard the men in their cells vomiting. They couldn't see Alan's suffering, but they shared it with every scream Alan released. Shrieking in agony, Alan struggled desperately to push his body up and off the pole. His arms hadn't been tied, but they weren't long enough to allow him to push himself from the ground and raise his body over the top of the pole. Daniel decided he couldn't watch further and tried to close his eyes and make it all disappear, but the guards forced him to keep watching. The blood from Alan's anal area kept flowing, further darkening the soil around him. He continued to struggle, trying to push his body from the pole. Daniel knew that his struggles only served to speed the bleeding and his eventual death. Maybe by speeding his death, it lessened his suffering. Alan's struggles finally slowed. His arms continued pushing against the ground as he tried to separate himself from the pole, but they showed almost no strength. After what felt like an eternity, Alan's body went limp. The ground around him had been stained a deep, dark red, but Daniel could see he was still alive. The rise and fall of his chest were easily visible due to his skinny frame. Captain Pham barked an order, and guards returned Daniel into his cell. He nearly had to be carried. What he'd witnessed magnified his already starved and weakened state. Daniel leaned against the wall that he and Alan had so often used to communicate and cried, trying to flush from his mind the sight of Alan's futile struggle with the pole, the little prison that held Alan captive and took his life. The horrifying images would surely haunt him for the rest of his life.